Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and the program is Everything Cooperative. And we have a special guest this morning, Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard, who has been on before. And this month, we're celebrating Women's History Month, and the theme is Women Who Advocate for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And Dr. Nembhard is one of those people that advocate for DEI as a professor at John Jay and a researcher and a writer and a speaker. Good morning, Dr. Nembhard.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on. Why do you teach about DEI? How do you teach about DEI, and why?
Right. Well, I am a professor of Africana Studies at John Jay. Even though I'm an economist, I actually teach in a Black Studies department, Africana Studies. And so I'm always teaching about institutional racism, etc. But I also realized in the co-op sphere that the co-op world needed to reckon with diversity in ways that we hadn't. When I first started in the co-op movement in the 90s, I was one of the only black people, especially black women. There were a few people in the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, so when we were in the South, sometimes I met up with them. I think you were probably doing housing co-ops, but I was more interested in urban co-op development and worker co-ops, and so I felt like a token black person, and when I brought up issues about race and black co-ops, there was a lot of ignorance, I guess is the best word.
Okay.
People would tell me they didn't know when I asked, like, so where are the black co-ops? Where are the black cooperators? Even when I went into black communities, again, aside from being in the South with the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, in other black communities, people would tell me black folks don't do co-ops. And then when I started bringing some black folks into the co-op movement, a lot of them didn't feel comfortable, especially the young black folks. So I started questioning. I'm a researcher, so I start with questions. Mm-hmm. That's how I approach people, and that's how I approach topics. So, the more questions I asked, the more people started thinking about it. And the more I started doing the research to say these myths are wrong, right? So the myth that black people don't do co-ops, that was wrong. And so I found a million examples of how we do co-ops, right? The myth that we don't have a legacy of thinking through a strategy of using co-ops, right? I debunked that myth. But then, as we got into the 21st century, and I forget what year this was, but actually the NCBA was the first group that actually asked me to deliberately talk about diversity and inclusion in co-ops. And so I was a keynote at I guess it was one of the first or second impact conferences when they re-established the impact conferences. And I said to Doug at the time, head of NCBA, Doug O'Brien, I said, well, how honest do you want me to be? Mm-hmm. And he said, you should be as honest as you want. So I tried to be as honest as I could, but constructive, right? And so basically my message, and it's still a message, and I'll explain where and how else I teach it like this, but I started out there saying, first of all, diversity and inclusion aren't even enough. If you want to talk about really transforming our co-ops and being good to our word about everybody's welcome and all that kind of stuff, we have to go beyond inclusion and get to equity and justice. And what does that mean, right? Well, diversity, and this is what I talk about, diversity, is kind of representation, right? Numbers, just having people there, right? Well, we know that's not enough because I've spent most of my life being a token black person in white spaces, and it's not enough. And I also get tired of being the token because you expect us to speak for everybody, and I can't and don't want to speak for everybody. So diversity is just the very first step, right? Then even inclusion, right, isn't enough because being included doesn't change the power dynamics, right? Some people talk about a dance, right? Being invited to the dance is sort of diversity. Everybody can come, but who gets asked to dance, who gets to have input into what kind of food and music is there, that kind of stuff. That's more about inclusion. But then where does the decision making really happen? And do you have voices that people really hear or just, again, token voices? So that gets us more to equity, right? Having people there who have equal power as everybody else, who have equal participation, right? Who have been treated with dignity and included in the power parts of what's happening. And also for equity, we talk about, right, it's about more than equality, right? Because even if you give differently status people the same opportunity or the same one vote, sometimes it's not enough because they're in a deficit. They come with a deficit or they come without the same experience or whatever. So equity also means filling the gaps, right? Providing people with the tools that they need in order to participate equally. But then sometimes that's not even enough because, again, we're just trying to, quote-unquote, fill in gaps, and it's still kind of a deficit model. So justice gets us to the asset model, right? What does it mean to actually seriously address the problems in your co-op, if we're talking about co-ops, in your co-op that will not just make sure people can equitably participate and equitably be involved, but also that we're changing the terms, fixing the power imbalances, and doing things, creating policies, practices that actually undo the oppressive, unequal, marginalizing policies that our whole society do. So we don't want to reproduce our whole society, right? So we have to get the justice is the sort of the action part, right? So if diversity is just numbers, right, and representation, justice is the actual part where you're trying to actively transform things, not just accommodate.
So
I teach about that.
You're teaching about how to right the wrongs of 400 years of slavery and Jim Crow and racism and, yes, lynching,
right, and how
all
to recognize, right, how to recognize that it's about systems analysis. It's not just about whether I and my co-op tolerate another culture, another language, another human being, but it's do I, as a member of a co-op, as a member of a group, am I committed to changing the ways we all relate, and hopefully that would also change what happens in the society. I found for co-ops that we feel like because we think we're so liberal, right, because we have this new economic structure, right, because we believe in democracy in our economic structure, we think we've done all the work that we need to do as human beings when we haven't. Because it's much more difficult to undo racism, even ableism. I talk about not just racism, gender inequality, heteropatriarchy, and ableism, because co-ops also, we tend to focus on the able, the people who can participate. We don't think about the people who have barriers to participation, whether it's blindness or hearing issues or a different language or other kinds of disabilities or marginality. And so we've got to be aware of all, if we really want to be those, really want to do economic democracy and economic justice, we have to be aware of all those multiple oppressions and the microaggressions that we might manifest without even being intentional about it.
So, Dr. Nembhard, I want to bring politics in a little bit. With everything that our past president, I want to do like Biden, previous president has done and is doing and opened the doors for those that seemingly like racism and like white supremacy and all of that. How do you see all of this work in DEI, this ableism, I've not dealt with ableism. All the other ones, whether it's sexism or religiously or whatever it might be. But how do you get those folks to try to change their mind? Or how do you work in a system to create all of this DEI injustice when you have all of these other folks in the world, and they seem like they're more emboldened now than they have in the last 50 years?
Yeah. So we're back to a backlash time, right? This is very similar to the 1880s and 1890s in the U.S. when there was the backlash against the Reconstruction and the attempt for the U.S. to be, to deal with, at least with race better. Now we're back in a backlash because it's not just race people are dealing with, it's gender, sexual orientation, etc. I think there's really two prongs, right? First, we have to work with ourselves, and I don't mean just as individuals. I mean, again, ourselves as co-op, right, in the co-op movement, right? Because I think the co-op movement can model, there's so much we can model, right? We can model economic democracy. We can also model this kind of transformation that we're talking about, of really embracing inclusion, equity, and justice, right? So we can model it. So first, we have to start recognizing what the best practices are in this area, right? We've got to understand institutional racism. We've got to understand the social construction of race and the social construction of gender. We have to understand ableism, which is one of the hardest ones to understand. I was just reading something, I should remember the woman's name, but she was dealing with racism and heteropatriarchy, that's not the right word, but anyway, patriarchy and stuff, and she realized that if she didn't deal with ableism too, she couldn't change all the structures, because we're so focused on who has the capacity and who we admire and following them, right, that we have to make space for people who have different capacities and different strengths, differing capacities and differing strengths. So if we don't do that within ourselves first, within our groups, our own groups, within our co-ops, we're not going to make any progress out there. And in the 1880s, they were doing the same thing. Even though it was a hugely repressive period, it's the beginning of Jim Crow, it's the beginning of the Ku Klux Klan and other new forms of white supremacist violence. We also had a fantastic co-op movement, labor movement, populist movement, belief in integration, right? Small groups, small activities doing stuff in their own way, but modeling it so that by the time we're in the 1920s and the 1930s, we can get out of that horrible mode, and we've been able to show and convince people. Not everybody's going to be convinced, but we can begin to show. So if we model it ourselves, then the second step is to then take it outside and try to convince and teach other people. But if we can't show how it works properly, and that it doesn't have to diminish anybody, because I think that's the backlash we're having now, and the previous president fed on this, right? There was so much insecurity among white men, among poor white people, feeling like there was a limited pie, and that if we expanded to let everybody in and to make sure everybody was taken care of, that they would lose, right? I feel like that's really what they're struggling with. They think they're going to be the loser. They're going to lose jobs. They're going to lose their own heritage, right? So we have to show them that you don't have to lose, right? It's an expanding pie. It's not a constricting pie, and that we can all win if we do this correctly. Nobody has to give up anything. And I've now started talking more about the language of economics of abundance, right? Because usually we talk about economics as scarcity. And to me, the economics of abundance also includes, what do I call it? DIEJ, right? DIEJ, diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice, is part of that narrative of abundance, right? This is ways that we can be stronger, better, transformative, and people don't have to give up their own identities and their own orientations. They have to be willing to embrace others and let other people embrace theirs, and learn from other cultures, other languages. Like language justice doesn't have to, just because you're bilingual doesn't mean we're undermining English. Look at the Canadians, right? They're bilingual. Everything has to be in French and Spanish, and all their children have to learn both languages. But that's just, learning two languages is actually better for our brain. So we're not giving up things.
Well, it's also interesting as you're talking that the pie right now, 90% of the wealth is in, I'm making this number up, 90% of the wealth is in the hands of 10% of the population.
Yeah, that's close.
And so that means that 10% of wealth is then allocated to 90% of the people. If you readjust that pie, particularly through taxation, then that would be a way of, okay, you take the same pie and you spread it out to more and more people, even before you start increasing the pie, the size of the pie, which is available to do also.
Right. I mean, we can definitely change distribution, but I was saying let's not use that language. Let's use the expanding the pie, because I believe so much of the opposition, so much of the white supremacist violence right now is because they're afraid about having to give up. They think they have to give up something for equality to happen. And I'm saying I don't know that we don't have to ask people to give up stuff. We have to ask the country to transform ourselves so that we broaden things, so that we can all, fundamentally, I agree with you. We need redistribution because so much of the wealth is unfairly and illegally in the hands of that 1%. So I don't want to really argue against that, but I'm saying in the language of diversity, inclusion, equity, I don't think we have to focus on what people have to give up. We need to focus on how to build so that we can all have what we need. And then people won't feel like what they're giving up is giving up, right?
Right. Because
again, for poor whites, what are they giving up? They think they're giving up prestige. They think they're giving up, some power that money gives them, ability to do stuff. But what if we had an economic system where they could, do what they needed? They could get the medicines they need, have the health care they need, have access to food, have a nice house to live in, have beautiful shared vacation houses that they could go to for vacation. They had meaningful work and good jobs that they weren't afraid of losing. If they had all that, just like the rest of us want, then why would they bother us about whether we had some more say or whether we had the same access that they had, right? It's because they feel like they're either going to lose or they're not going to be that millionaire, right? Because that's the other problem. Everybody wants to grow up to be a millionaire and they feel like they have to give that up. But I'm saying technically we don't have to give that up. If we're transforming our society in ways that meets everybody's needs, we can all be a middle-class society. It sounds a little utopian, but I honestly believe co-ops can get us there.
Wow. Who else? What women today are also talking about, teaching about DEI and justice?
Yeah, well, there's LaDonna Redmond. She's actually written a toolkit through Colluminate, I believe. And then also at Colluminate would be Jamila Medley. Also my friend and colleague, Adjoa Ifeteyo, who's in housing co-ops and worker co-ops. She also does some workshops on diversity and inclusion, that kind of thing. And we both work together in grassroots economic organizing, and we often try to address topics like that. There's a woman in Sociocracy for All, I can't remember her name, but in about 2 years ago they did a conference and they actually had me come and do a session on DIEJ, and sociocracy is that methodology of how to really keep democracy local. And so they were interested because they realized even in teaching people sociocracy that they needed to pay attention to diversity and inclusion issues. So I'm excited about people out there. And of course, most of innovative stuff we do in the social and economic and cultural spheres are run or headed or influenced by black women. So
could you say that again, please? What did you say?
I said most of the socio-cultural and economic innovations and progress are headed by or influenced by black women.
Yes. Yeah. Got it, understand it, believe it. And my mother was one of those.
I'm sure.
And her influence was particularly in the family. But, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm sorry I can't name more people, but I'd love to celebrate, right, the role that women have played in making sure that these things are both understandable and doable.
So you have been doing some research in Puerto Rico.
Yes.
What is the lady's name there that has been working on DEI and justice that you've been working with?
Lee-Marie Nieves, she's actually, she works at a credit union in Puerto Rico. I don't even remember the name of the credit union. But early on, she was asked to do co-op education in a prison program. It was actually a woman before her that she named the last time I spoke with her, who I can't remember, who started doing the education for Cooperative Aragos, the sculptors cooperative in one of the prisons in Puerto Rico. And that woman was unable to continue after, I think, 2 or 3 years when she first worked with them. And she asked Lee-Marie to take over. And Lee-Marie has been doing that work probably since 2015, 2014, something like that. She's helped to create, I think it's 5 co-ops in Puerto Rican prisons over the years. Now, unfortunately, since COVID, all those co-ops have been on hiatus, and they're fighting right now to get permission to start the co-ops back up in the prisons. But for that 15-year period when the co-ops were flourishing, she was doing fantastic work, and I know this for 2 reasons. One, she was introduced to me when I was a board member on ACE with Jaime Cuevas from Seguros Múltiples, before he left Seguros Múltiples, and he heard me talk about some interest in co-ops in prisons and mentioned to me when the opening for the women's prison, Tanos, I think their name is, the women's co-op was opening. And then when I told him I wanted more information, he said, oh, you need to speak with Lee-Marie. And then I was actually able to get a little bit of money to bring Lee-Marie and one of the formerly incarcerated members of the co-op to a bunch of worker co-op and ACE meetings. I think it was in 2015, 2016. But then I was able, when I was in Puerto Rico last summer, I was able to actually interview 3 more former members of the co-op. These are all people who were in leadership, presidents, secretaries of the co-op. And in addition to them telling me fantastic, fascinating things about how the co-op saved their lives, changed their lives, basically helped them to regain their humanity, they also talked about Lee-Marie's training and how important that was, and her helping them to understand what it means to be a cooperator. And for one of the issues, right, first of all, when you're behind bars and cages, your humanity is pretty much stripped from you, and you're kind of just trying to survive as an individual. But they realized when they were in an art therapy class, the first co-op came out of an art therapy class, and they were making sculptures. They realized that they were actually, as artists, they were kind of working together, and that they could sell their art. They wanted a model that matched the way they were collaborating in the artwork itself, and so they wanted a co-op model. So that first group of prisoners actually demanded co-op education, but then once they were getting the co-op education, their eyes were open to a whole different way of operating, and that it doesn't have to be a man-eat-man world. And for them, diversity just about racial and skin color diversity. It was also about experiences and gang affiliations. So one of the things one of the former members told me was how important it was for them to look at the co-op principles and rewrite them in ways that made sense to incarcerated people. And one of the things was that very first principle about everybody belongs, and open and voluntary participation, that open meant that it didn't matter if you were gay, it didn't matter which gang you came from, it didn't matter which region of Puerto Rico you came from. We could all be in one co-op together, and we could work together. And that was partly the training that Lee-Marie gave them when she broke down each of the principles and explained to them, right? So they really took diversity and inclusion to their personal experience. Like, what does diversity and inclusion mean inside a jail with people who are considered deviants and thieves, right? What does that mean to then everybody belongs and we can all work together? They also had a rule that if you were a parent, you had to use some of your earnings to pay child support. And that was a rule in the co-op because, again, it was very important to them that they were using the co-op as a way to give back to their families, right, to pay back their debts, to be good parents, that kind of thing.
So wait a minute, I need to go all the way back a minute, though. Make sure I've got it. So these are people, 2014, 2015 or so, they're in jail in the arts class, and they started making sculpture. And then they said they could sell
it. They were in an art class. It was probably 2011 because the co-op actually started in 2012. I learned about it around 2014, 2015. But anyway, yes.
Okay.
So they were in an art class. They were doing art therapy, making sculptures, realizing they wanted to do some kind of business together. And the way they were doing their sculptures, sometimes it was a joint project. Some people made the stand for the sculpture. Some people painted the sculpture. Some people actually did the sculpture. So they realized they were doing this collectively. They wanted to find a business model that would reflect the way they were doing their art.
Okay.
And they laugh and say they started the co-op because their families got tired of them sending these sculptures home, and they had to figure out something to do with, because they kept producing more and more sculptures. And so they realized, okay, maybe we could sell them. But they didn't want a regular, just sole proprietor kind of business. They wanted to do this collectively and to reflect the way they felt their art was going.
Wow. And so then this Marie Nieves comes in to train them about co-ops.
Right.
Right.
So how do you start why would you start a co-op? How do you start a co-op? What does it mean to be in a co-op? What are the rules? How do you incorporate? So she stuck with them and really did continuous training, because that's the other thing they said. They realized it wasn't good enough to get enough training to incorporate as a co-op. They also need continuous training of how to keep the co-op going. And I know we're about to go on break, right?
So, yes, we need to go on break, and I want to come back and talk more about the experience of the co-ops inside a prison, and what did it do to bring back humanity to people, how they feel, get some dignity and hope back,
right.
which is one of the things that I've been told that people that are in prisons that have co-ops get back.
Right.
We'll be right back, and I guess I want to talk some more about, when we come up, other women that have been in the co-op space. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial. Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and the program is Everything Co-op, and we're talking to Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard about DEI and justice. Jessica, this month is 10.5 years we've been on air.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you. And we really appreciate your support and coming out and training us and teaching us all about your research and what you've been doing. And National Co-op Bank has been our main financial supporter. Their mission is to support and be an advocate for America's cooperatives and their members, especially in low-income communities, by providing innovative financial and related services, and they've been just a great partner. So before the break, we were talking about Marie Nieves, who has been doing training inside of prisons in Puerto Rico to help them to start co-ops. You had said, which caught my attention, these co-ops have not been working since COVID started, and they're looking at getting them back. Where are they? You know where they are now in getting these co-op back in operation?
They were hopeful that there was going to be a program in October of 23 that would announce that they were going to start them back up again. And I actually lost contact, so I haven't been able to get an update on that. So I'm not sure if they have them back operating yet. But we have been putting together, especially Marie and her husband. Actually, she ended up marrying one of the co-op members after he got out. And they have a whole sort of ministry and a co-op ministry, and they work inside and outside. They've been trying to start some hybrid co-ops outside with previously incarcerated members and other citizens as members, and they're also still doing some co-op education and still talking about these models. So they've been working hard to document some of the benefits so that the corrections can remember how successful these co-ops were. Some of the benefits were actually benefits to the corrections. All the co-ops had to have MOUs, Memorandum of Understanding, with the corrections departments, and that included paying, when I first started studying them, they were paying about 15% of their revenues to the corrections department to pay for electricity, renting space, use of computers, that kind of thing. Now, not now, but before COVID, the corrections offices had increased that to 25%. So they're making money off of these co-ops.
25% of what? 25% of
revenues,
what?
Of the co-ops' revenues.
Of the revenue, not the profit, the revenue. Okay.
Are paid back to corrections to cover all the costs corrections have of housing that business. In addition to that, the co-ops that were allowed to go outside, like the arts co-op, they were allowed to go outside of the co-op to sell their wares. In fact, their main customers were other co-ops. Other co-ops invited them to their AGMs and stuff, and they would go out. So they would allow one or two of their officers with a paid guard to go out. So the co-op also paid all those expenses, including the guards. So the prisons were actually making money off of these co-ops. In addition to it changing the behavior of the co-op members. So one of the other things when I did my interviews, one of the other things some of the former members were telling me was how high their sentences were. A lot of, in the first years of Cooperative Aragos, they were electing members who had the longest sentences to be officers because they thought it was important that those people who were going to stay in the prison be officers. So they had a lot of their first presidents had like 99-year sentences. All of them are out. All of the first 5 presidents, even with their 99-year sentences, got commuted sentences because of their good behavior and how they operated once they were a co-op member. They're all out now. Most of them were out after 5 to 15-year service.
Wait. Hold a minute.
But they had sentences that were over 99 years. Yeah, so it's just an amazing story.
You're telling me that people in prison have 99-year sentences. They join a co-op, get this training, learn how to operate with each other.
Right, become leaders of the co-op.
Become leaders.
Officers in the co-op. And their behavior changes so much that they get most of their sentence commuted and are out within 10 to 15 years of having joined the co-op.
Well, that story by itself seems like the prisoners would want to be in the co-ops, and the people that work in the prisons would want.
They didn't seem to have any problem getting members. In fact, I think a lot of people wanted to be members of these different co-ops. So there's also there was a solar panel co-op. The women's co-op, I believe, did baking. No, sorry, they were going to do baking. They ended up doing sewing. And then I just found out the last time I did the interviews in last August that they also had a cafe outside the prison walls. They were operating a cafe for breakfast and lunch where they were selling co-op baked goods from co-ops in Puerto Rico, and they were selling the sewing products from the women's sewing co-op that was in the prison next door, the women's prison next door. So this cafe, they were actually going out of the doors, out of the bars of the prison daily to work in their co-op and then going back at night to sleep in the prison. So fascinating stuff, and these are people who were able to do this because Lee Marie Nieves was teaching them not just cooperative economics, but how to run a good co-op, how to interface with other people. When I interviewed these men, they were telling me about how this woman taught them how to negotiate with the corrections officers, right? How to get those MOUs passed, how to argue their cases. One of the former presidents was telling me how, normally prisoners are not allowed to handle money, even if they have a job, right? It goes through a prison office. But he said, according to co-op law, right, the treasurer of the co-op is supposed to have the books, write the checks, whatever. He was able to argue for why he should keep the checkbooks and be a signer on the checks and have it locked up in the desk in the office that he had that they were renting from the prison, because co-op law said that was his responsibility. And how could the corrections people tell him that he can't follow co-op law when his business was incorporated as a co-op? So this just fascinating stuff happening here. And their account was in a credit union, right? They also got support and help from the credit unions, from the insurance co-ops, from the whole co-op community. So it's really a fascinating story of co-op ecosystem as well as human development.
So you've talked about Principle 5, which is the education, training, and information. And now you're talking about Principle 6, which is cooperation among co-ops.
Co-ops, right.
Yeah.
And we did Principle 1, right, about inclusion, and we did democratic participation, right? So they were able to apply. And again, because Lee Marie was teaching them this in a way that made sense to their status and situation, they were able to use these co-op principles, co-op laws, co-op relationship building to make a life for them in a place that normally would have been just inhuman, horrible, dehumanizing situation. They were able to assert themselves as human beings and create a space for themselves as human beings, even though they were in cages.
So when you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, we talk about racism and sexism and all of the different kinds of isms that we have. But the one that always gets me is the ism against prisoners, people that have either been justly incarcerated or unjustly incarcerated, but they're coming back into society, how difficult it is, and sometimes impossible, and that's why more and more people end back up in prison. But when I studied the bakery in an Italian prison, the incarceration rate was like 3%. People.
The recidivism rate.
Thank you. Recidivism rate was so small.
Right. It's tiny in these examples. Very small. The Puerto Rican model, they said they only had 2 out of the first 50 people that got out, only 2 recidivisms, and 1 was out on parole in another 6 months or something. So only 1 full recidivism out of 50 in their first, there's not a lot of data all the time, but yeah.
That's 2%.
And then when you hear, it's 2%. And when, and as I said, I interviewed 4 people, and just when you talk to them, it's just fantastic to hear them talk about their transformation as a human being and what the co-op has meant to them and what skills and relationships continued even once they were out and not able to participate in their co-op anymore.
Well, the 4th principle of autonomy and independence you talked about also when you said that the person that was writing the check went and argued that that's co-op law. They have to have the autonomy. They have to own it and control it. So you really talked about that principle, and that principle helped them to control the money and have the responsibility of doing that. There's a lot of growth when one has that. The one principle we haven't talked about is member economic participation. Normally there's a fee to join a co-op, and when there's profit, that profit is shared, and the board of directors say how that's shared, what happens to that profit or surplus. How did that work in this prison system? Right.
So these are worker co-ops. So they're able, you join the co-op, and then they can take out your membership fee from your first disbursement, your first salary, or your first patronage refund or dividend, right? So that's how they did that. I think some of the startup money, and I don't know all the details yet, but I believe a lot of the startup money came from the Puerto Rican League of Cooperatives or members of the Puerto Rican League of Co-ops. So again, it's back to the ecosystem support, cooperation among cooperatives. Mm-hmm. The co-op ecosystem in Puerto Rico really has supported this program, including, right, the educators were volunteers, right? Lee Marie never got any money for her training for 15 years of co-op training, but her credit union allowed her the time, right, the volunteer time to go into the prison, so that she never charged them for her co-op services, but her credit union gave her time to go do that volunteer work. So the the economic participation, so right, as worker co-ops, they can pay in installments, they can pay their membership dues, and actually none of them ever told me what the membership dues was, so I don't know what it was, but they pay it out of their initial money. But they did explain to me that, again, this was one of the first things Lee Marie helped them to talk about once they were incorporated. How did they want to disperse and share the profits or share the revenues, really, right? And so they talked about, right, again, some of the sculptures were made individually, some were made with 2 or 3 people contributing to a sculpture. So they created this agreement about how people, once the sculpture was sold, what percentage would go back to each individual, the artist's part, what percentage would go back into the co-op, what percent, that kind of thing. So there was agreements early on when you signed on to be a member. You were already agreeing to this process of income generation, right? So they agreed on how much they were charging for their sculptures. They agreed on what part went back to the artist, that kind of thing. And so they were able, again, to do this democratic participation. And as I said, you had to agree, if you were a parent, that a certain amount of your money would go to child care and go back to your family. Not that people didn't want to do that, but they wanted to make sure that people didn't forget their children. And so they built it into their policies that you had to pay some of your what you were earning back to your family, and they made sure of how that happened. So they had a lot of discussion and real participation about the economic side, right? And of course, in prison, if you get paid at all, it's usually slave labor and whatever. This time they're able to control their own labor and their own income as best as possible while still behind bars.
So these co-ops were inside the prison. What happened when they left? Did they still work in the co-op?
Right. So that was the only problem. They could not continue to work in the co-op when they left. So they did try to start some co-ops outside, but there's actually some complications. Like they actually had to get a law change so that while they were incarcerated, they could own their own co-ops. Originally, the law said that you couldn't be incarcerated and be a co-op member, or especially not a board member. So they actually went to the legislature and got the law changed, but they forgot to change the previously incarcerated. So they're still working on changing the language when you're previously incarcerated. But also, most prisons, when you're on parole, you're not supposed to cavort with other previously incarcerated people. So it's also hard for them to start co-ops with other previously incarcerated people because of the way the laws are and because of the way previously incarcerated people are treated, especially once, first when you come out, you're on parole for a while. So that period, which should be a great time to start co-ops and get people established, they haven't been able to get that law changed yet so that they can do that. So that's one of the things they're also working on now. That's why Lee Marie and her husband, Alan, did try to start what they were calling a hybrid co-op, part previously incarcerated people and part citizens who hadn't been involved in the law with legal issues. But then COVID started, and so they had trouble keeping that going, but they're trying to resurrect that also as a way to be a transition strategy.
Okay, so I am wanting to go to Puerto Rico in the next 3 to 4 weeks, literally. I'd like to meet Lynn, Marie, and Alan. I don't know if you know this, but I lived 5 years in Puerto Rico.
Oh, I don't think I knew that. Wow.
In San Juan. I ran a Cummins engine company distributorship for Cummins there.
Oh, my gosh.
And I really do want to go there. I was looking for somewhere to go warm that fits and to talk to them and see if there's any way I could support them in starting these co-ops. One of the things I liked about the co-op in Italy, this bakery, was that it was for people inside the prisons and outside.
Right.
And so it was a bakery that provided baking goods, and when somebody left the prison, they automatically had a job. But not only did they have a job, they were owners of...
Right, they're already owners. Right, yeah. I love that inside-out model. Yeah. The Ethiopians don't quite have that, but you can stay a member of your co-op even once you're released from prison. And so then you do the reverse commute, right? You live outside and you work in your co-op while it's in the prison. So the Ethiopian model in Mekelle prison, that's how they solved that. So even once you got released, you didn't have to give up your co-op membership. You just lived outside of the co-op and then outside of the prison and then came back into the prison during the day to work in your co-op. So we need more strategies that have that inside-outside connection, because that also seems to make a huge difference.
Yes. Particularly when you compare, and unfortunately in my family, I have, it seems like more nephews and great-nephews that end up in prison than nieces. But they have such a hard time finding work when they come out.
Right. Yeah.
And meaningful work and anything that has anything to do with dignity or hope are just not there. And a lot of that has to do with the whole drugs issues and
stuff. Yeah. There is also, I have a colleague at UCLA who did a study. She found that previously incarcerated people who can get jobs in ESOPs, employee stock ownership companies, actually have a better experience and are able to have more better jobs, better paying jobs, more long-lasting jobs, and obviously access to retirement funds and that kind of thing, because ESOPs provide that. But yeah, she was able to study to find out. I don't know how well she looked at how they found or got into the ESOPs, but she did find that previously incarcerated who were able to get jobs in ESOPs, that was very helpful. So imagine worker co-ops, right? Imagine if they could be connected to worker co-ops. It would probably be even more beneficial.
Right. ESOPs are employee stock option plans. And so it sounds like ownership.
Right.
Employees owning, whether it's a co-op or an ESOP, have great benefits for previously incarcerated people.
Yes.
Yeah. The training is particularly important.
Right,
okay.
And the experience making decisions together, working together, right, is just phenomenal.
Yeah, it's nice to learn that you can solve issues without going to the OK Corral and have a shootout.
Right.
Okay. Yep. Yeah, it's extremely important. We don't have very much more time, but let's switch from Puerto Rico to D.C. Talk about Nannie Helen Burroughs, if you would.
Yeah, I was going to say, we can't leave here without me talking about Nannie Helen Burroughs. She will be inducted with you in the Co-op Hall of Fame in October 2024. So I believe we'll probably be on a panel together talking.
At least one, maybe two or three.
Before the event, at least, right? Nannie Helen Burroughs is another co-op shero. She's another really interesting person because she really didn't have to get involved in the co-op world. She was already, by 1900 or 1910 or whatever, she was already well known. She had started a school, which is, we have, I forget what her school is called now, but anyway, we have a street named after her in
Nannie
DC,
Helen Burroughs
the
School.
Nannie Helen Burroughs School.
And
but
Nannie
at the
Helen
time
Burroughs
she
Avenue.
started it.
Yep.
Right. And at the time she started the school, it was for women, black women and girls. So she wanted to make sure black women and girls got a good education. She also had started the Baptist Women's Convention to make sure National Baptist Women's Convention, to make sure throughout the country black Baptist women had a say and had activities in their church, in their churches, and in the national church. Right. So she was already well known as a civil rights person, as basically a women's advocate, women's education. But she was still concerned about women. She was worried about women in domestic service. This is in the 1920s and 30s. And then during the Great Depression, women who couldn't make a living at all. And she decided to bring the worker co-op model to Northeast D.C. And she started women with what they were calling and then indigent housewives and unemployed women, and got them making sewing, canning, making chairs. She wanted them to do something that was going to be production work, right? That was going to be worker-owned, so the women could own their own work and do their own work. She wanted to get them out of domestic service, both for better pay, but also to get the precarious sexual predator that happened to domestic women, right? Mm-hmm. And so she started the Northeast Self-Help Co-op, which was a series of these worker co-op or producer co-ops, I guess you could call them at the time, of women doing these productions. And where did she house the co-op? In the basement of her school, of course. Mm-hmm. She already had a building, right? She had infrastructure, so she leased, rooms in the basement of her school for these co-op endeavors. And then got community involvement. So she got people like Carter G. Woodson involved. He was on the board of the Greater Group. She got historian Chancellor Williams from Howard University on her board. And she started, this is the Great Depression. The New Deal is kicking in, and the New Deal actually has a self-help co-op division of the Commerce Department to help people start co-ops. Well, for 3 years straight, she applied for a grant and finally got it in the third year for her co-op and was able to expand the co-op. They were able to buy a farm in Maryland with that money and to also bring in their own produce, do a co-op distribution store, food distribution store, as well as do farming. So she actually pioneered what we now call a multi-stakeholder co-op, right? So she was having worker co-ops and consumer co-ops and producer co-ops, all under what she then called Cooperative Industries of D.C. So co-founded actually by another woman who I just forgot her name, and with lots of community support. She also joined the D.C. chapter of CLUSA, Cooperative League of the USA. She was a strong member. In fact, I found letters in her archives inviting her. They always were asking her to come and speak about co-ops. Apparently she was a fabulous speaker about co-ops, why co-ops, and how co-ops benefit your communities. So there's lots of letters from the head of the D.C. chapter of CLUSA inviting her, to asking her to come to this meeting to make this speech. We have letters in her archives from all over the country, people who heard about the project and wanted to order chairs and mattresses and stuff that the co-op had made. So fascinating. And she did interviews. So I found interviews in black journals interviewing her and talking about this model, and as I said, always talking about the uplift of women and the importance of labor owning their own work and doing productive work, right? She was really not that excited about consumer co-ops. She was interested in women doing worker co-ops and productive work and owning their own work, working together to make sure they had what they needed in a safe environment with work that was going to give them money that they could really make a living off of.
So with what you teach...
Oh, and she taught co-ops in her school. She made sure co-ops were taught in her school.
Oh, that would be good to have now.
Right. So she was also a co-op educator.
So with what you're doing, and Lee Marie Naives in Puerto Rico and Nanny Helen Barrows have done in D.C., what message would you like to leave people with tonight?
Gosh, there's so much we could say. I think... One, the importance of co-ops as a humanizing right? In such a dehumanizing, traumatizing world that we live in, right? Co-ops as a humanizing structure, and the way that black women and women of color have recognized the power of co-ops and then used it in every forum and in every format that they've been in. So to uplift women, to uplift prisoners, to change our relationship with community, to change our relationship to work, right? And that so many women of color have recognized how important it is to use the co-op model to uplift us as human beings and to change the nature of work.
Thank you, Dr. Nembhard. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, and maybe other women and men can start doing this work.
The preceding program was paid for by Everything Co-op.